This is a World War II presentation for the Pacific Campaign. This is the second of 3 presentations. Again, a reminder that all the images within this PowerPoint presentation, this video, are in the public domain. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to give me an email or a call. Again, this is the Pacific Campaign Part 2 of 3 presentations that go along with Chapter 34 and 35 in the textbook. And this is the World War II presentation on the Pacific Campaign. Just to put a few things into perspective, I'd like you to take a look at the dates here. 1931. 1931, Roosevelt is not even in office. Roosevelt was elected in 1932. Remember that the Great Depression, the stock market crash, occurs in October of 1929. So in the early 1930s, Japan invades China. So just keep in mind that the Great Dust Bowl that hits Kansas and Oklahoma is in 1936, 37. So this kind of invasion of China is not even on the United States radar. The United States did nothing to punish Japan for this action. So just keep that in mind. And Japan invaded China through the boot, we'll put it in a different color here, through the boot of Korea and into China, and the horrible atrocities that the Japanese soldiers committed, both against the Korean people but also against the Japanese or the Chinese people, are well documented in the book Rape of Nanking, also in the book by James Bradley, Flyboys. You'll have a chance to read a few chapters out of that book later. But we'll focus on this idea that the Japanese are invading both Korea and China to expand their empire, and this is going on during the height of the Great Depression in the United States. So shortly after the invasion of both Korea and then China, the Japanese expand into the Pacific, and their expansion is to kind of counter the United States attempt to get islands throughout the Pacific. Once the United States gains Hawaii and then some of the islands in the Pacific, we have the Philippines from the Spanish-American War. The Japanese are trying to take this from the United States. And so the expansionist tendencies of the Japanese run very counter to the United States' attempt to influence the region. So I mentioned this book, The Rape of Nanking, and this again is the timetable here. This is March 1937, 1938. 369,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were slaughtered by the invading Japanese troops. 80,000 women were raped. Many of these were then mutilated, and this is a horrifying picture of decapitated heads. But this is a book that is well documented, written with testimony from American missionaries who were in China and witnessed some of these atrocities. In addition to the Rape of Nanking book, we also then have Flyboys. Flyboys is written by James Bradley. We'll be having a chance to read a couple of those chapters, read Chapter 5 and Chapter 8 with some questions. But these are some images, horrible images of the Japanese advanced officers being trained by using live prisoners and using bayonets and jabbing them in the chest to practice and to understand what it was like to actually, not to jab straw dummies or sandbags, but actual live people. And then there was a well-documented race of certain Japanese commanders, race to see which would be the first to reach 100 decapitations over a period of a couple of weeks. And so James Bradley, if you ever want to have a good book to read about the Pacific Campaign, Flyboys is the book. This is a photograph of an Australian soldier being decapitated. This book, this photograph was distributed to all soldiers, American in Australian, just as a reminder that if you get captured by the Japanese, this is what could potentially happen to you. So this photograph is George Siflet, and he was the soldier that is in this photograph. He did not survive. Of course, that leads then to Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Pearl Harbor. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because there's so much information available. If you're interested, you can sure look online for that. But December 7th, 1941, at 8 o'clock, the Japanese launched this surprise attack. 20 warships were destroyed, 200 aircraft, and 2,400 Americans were killed. So the next day, Roosevelt goes to Congress and asks Congress to declare war on Japan, and then by the next several days, Germany declares war on the United States. And this is a very famous photograph of Roosevelt's address to the joint sessions of Congress asking for their declaration of war. Remember, the President of the United States does not declare war. Declaration of war is done by Congress. Once the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, take a look at this map. Once the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, the United States has to retreat. We retreat and fortify Hawaii. And then we take a period of several months to reevaluate and kind of regroup and rebuild our military, our Navy in this Pacific region. And then our strategy is to go from island to island to island and get eventually closer and closer and closer to hopefully Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Once we get these two islands, we can go round the clock bombing back and forth and gain air superiority, and we firebomb Japan. So there are several very important battles that take place. Nimitz, we have Charles Nimitz as the commander of the Pacific Fleet. And some of the first battles of 1942, remember, Pearl Harbor occurs at the very end of 41. And so in the spring and summer of 42, we have the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, and Guadalcanal. So Midway becomes a very important battle. If Midway falls, then the Japanese will be able to continue to bombard Hawaii. But because we are able to defend Midway and sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, we then have fortified the island of Hawaii, and we can kind of launch our strategy of getting back island by island by island. So anyway, that is kind of the strategy that begins the War of the Pacific in the spring and summer of 1942. So air, land, and naval forces would seize Japanese-held islands in the Central Pacific and set up their air bases. This is the idea of island hopping, and this meant that troops would attack and seize only certain strategic Japanese-held islands, and then airstrips would be built on these seized islands that would help support the advance. So if you talk about Tarawa, Saipan, Philippines, Iwo Jima and Okinawa become very important as well. Ultimately this leads to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this Manhattan Project. So we'll talk about those here shortly. Battle of Iwo Jima is probably one of the most famous in the Pacific, and that's where we have the storming of Mount Sarabucci and the raising of the American flag. So this is the mount. We'll have a couple of photographs here next. So this is the famous Joe Rosenthal, and he's the photographer who took this landmark American photograph. These soldiers raising the flag on top of Mount Sarabucci. And this is a photograph of the mountain, or the mount that was stormed with Japanese entrenched throughout all of this. It's a very small island, but it was necessary to gain an airfield. And these are some other photographs of the invasion that occurs and the brutal fighting that existed. As you can see here, this is February of 1945, shortly after Valentine's Day of 1945. But this was called D-Day Iwo Jima, unlike D-Day Northern France. These are maps of the small island, and these are maps of the airstrips, but also then the Japanese fortifications. And then this shows the strategy involved here. Iwo Jima is close enough to the mainland that airplanes can now fly back and forth. It's short enough that you can have a heavy payload and enough fuel to get to Japan and come back. So that becomes very important. But it's a very small island, but necessary for the air campaign of World War II. And once then air superiority is gained and airstrips are gained, then we have the firebombing of Japan. And we have a short video that we'll watch from the documentary The Fog of War and Firebombing of Japan, and the interview of Robert McNamara, who eventually becomes Secretary of War and Secretary of Defense for the United States, but at the time he was an advisor to General LeMay. General LeMay made the decisions to switch from conventional high aerial bombing to lowering the planes, the B-29s, down to about 5,000 feet and dropping incendiary bombs, or ultimately napalm. And so the firebombing of Japan ultimately led to the surrender. At the same time, the United States was developing the atomic bomb, and this was called the Manhattan Project. So, of course, you can spend lots of time just researching the atomic bomb and Manhattan Project as well. These are the reasons used by Americans to justify this dropping of the bomb. Of course, if it ends the war quickly, it saves American lives, it saves money and resources. This is an important idea here that is sometimes neglected. But to show the power, especially Stalin realized that Stalin and the Soviet Union were still interested in Japan. And so if we can end the war quickly, then the Soviets do not get to intervene in post-World War II Japan. We were a little bit afraid that if the Soviets help us defeat Japan, then the Soviets get to also help determine the future of Japan. And so, of course, this is a very controversial debate, whether we drop the bomb or not. But these are at least Truman's justifications for dropping this atomic bomb. The bomb was dropped on August 6 in Hiroshima, August 9 Nagasaki, and then 5 days later, the Japanese surrender. VJ Day is Victory in Japan, August 14, 1945. And these are a couple photographs. This is the crew that flew the Enola Gay. Enola Gay is named after the pilot's mother, and the Enola Gay dropped these two bombs. Well, one bomb on Hiroshima. Those are the first two bombs that we had. And we'll end with a couple of photographs here of the effects, and these are some initial survivors of the actual of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these are some famous photographs of permanent shadows. The flash was so bright that background surfaces immediately got a little shade brighter, and where the flash was blocked stayed the same color. So you can see these are shadows that were kind of just permanently left on the side of a building there. And so pretty awesome effect of a bright flash from the atomic bomb. And we'll end with an aerial view of the two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the effects. So that concludes a very, very short presentation over the Pacific Campaign, World War II. Again, a reminder that these images are all in the public domain. Please do not hesitate to email or give me a phone call if you have any questions. We'll spend a lot more time in class going over all of these things in detail. Again, this just a Pacific Campaign alone could last for a full semester, but I tried to quickly go through as best I could some of the main points of the Pacific Campaign of World War II. This is a presentation that goes along with Chapter 34 and 35 in your textbook. Thank you.